As you all know, this event serves as something of an epilogue to the summer exhibition at Artispace that closed a little under a month ago, titled Living with Pop, a Reproduction of Capitalist Realism. I'm sure many of you had the opportunity to see the show, maybe even in Dusseldorf where it originated. It's great to have such a good Dusseldorf contingent here today. So I'm very pleased to welcome also the contributors to today's symposium, Howie Chen, Mark Fisher, Dorian Mende and Evan Calder-Williams. We're really grateful to them for committing the time to being here today and preparing their presentations. Sadly, one of the scheduled participants, Suzanne Rennert, has had to pull out at the last moment due to the ill health of her father. So we're sorry that she's not able to join us, and we'll miss her insight today, but we wish her and her father the best. Suzanne was one of the co-curators of the Living with Pop exhibition at Artispace, and as I mentioned, that exhibition was a collaboration with Kunsthalle Düsseldorf, where the exhibition originated in 2013. Those of you who saw the exhibition will know that it was grounded in the actions of 4 artists working in Düsseldorf in the 1960s: Manfred Kuttner, Konrad Loog, Sigmar Polk, and Gerhard Richter. These artists collectively coined the term capitalist realism and used it as a motif in a number of important exhibitions and actions that occurred in Düsseldorf and surrounding towns between 1963 and 1966. The term was also taken up by the Berlin-based gallerist René Bloch. He used it as the driving force for his gallery program in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He exhibited the work of Loog, Richter and Polk, along with other artists including K.P. Bremer, Karl Horst Rüdiger and Wolf Vostel, under the capitalist realist brand, utilizing the term strategically in relation to the socialist realism of East Germany. Bloch stated a far more directly political agenda for this movement than the Düsseldorf artists, pronouncing his intentions to conduct active art politics and actively intervene in social processes. The capitalist realism of particularly Loog, Richter and Polka located itself around the evasiveness of ideology, its permeation into the fabric of life and into the images that mediated subjective experience. The realism they invoked was a willfully empty one. There was nothing to show but banality and bureaucracy. This emptiness simultaneously managed to articulate the absence and erasure at the heart of the trauma of Germany's Nazi history and the empty aspirational drive of capital. Suzanne Rennert's research into the interweaving relations between artists and gallerists in Düsseldorf and the Rhineland in the late 1950s and early 1960s has highlighted the grounding of capitalist realism in Fluxus, a more immediate and close-to-hand influence than that of American pop art. In her catalogue essay for Living with Pop, she states, "The affirmative aspects of pop art are overtaken by the destructive, the intentional approach of art and life, and the tendency towards dematerialization." Gerhard Richter himself stated in an interview with Kuze von Bruggen that he was particularly attracted by Fluxus's cynical and destructive aspects. Rennert has gone further in tracing this association with Fluxus to the taking up of material and performative concerns by Loog, Richter and Polka. Most notably, she draws a connection between the Fluxus artist Wolf Vostel's decollage actions, in which he used chemicals to wipe out the political articles from a popular magazine, and the blurring and deformation of the photographic image in the paintings of Polka and Richter. I have used the term epilogue to describe today's symposium in relation to the Living with Pop exhibition, but the intention this afternoon is not to bring discursive closure to the exhibition's narration of the art historical episode of capitalist realism, but instead to see how the term continues to have resonance today while operating under dramatically altered terms in relation to its critical dimensions. Instead of retreading the ground of the exhibition, we've chosen this afternoon to consider the ripples and resonances that have spread outwards from the actions of the Düsseldorf artists and their parodic self-identification as capitalist realists. The presentations we'll hear this afternoon will in some instances stem from underexplored linguistic and conceptual aspects of the artistic production labelled in the 60s and 70s as capitalist realist, and in other cases will depart from a contemporary application of the term. We're very pleased to be joined today by writer and cultural theorist Mark Fisher, whose 2009 book, Capitalist Realism is the No Alternative, compellingly repurposed the term capitalist realism towards an understanding of our contemporary condition in which capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable. After the fall of communism and the Berlin Wall in 1989, capitalism can be seen to be no longer engaged with processes of containing and absorbing energies from outside, the processes that were implicitly articulated in the 1960s by the Dusseldorf artists, and more directly addressed by René Bloch's program in Berlin. In Marx's words, capitalist realism today is not a particular type of realism, it is more like realism in itself. It is more like a pervasive atmosphere conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. This expansion of the term capitalist realism forms the second touchstone for today's symposium, and the understanding of reality as uniformly structured by a naturalized ideology raises questions around the shifting grounds of artistic critique and of realism as a critical strategy. In an interview in 1966, Gerhard Richter stated, "I am fascinated by the human, temporal, real, logical side of an occurrence which is simultaneously so unreal, so incomprehensible, and so atemporal. And I would like to represent it in such a way that this simultaneity is preserved." This idea of simultaneity projects forward into the present and the challenges of addressing capitalism and its operations as mere contingency, not as empirical fact and necessity. So the format for today is that each of our speakers will give a presentation around half an hour in length, and after each talk there will be time for questions from the audience. We'll then have a break midway through, and depending on how we are for time and energy levels, there will be a discussion at the end between the four participants, with more opportunity for questions and thoughts from you, the audience. So the first two speakers today are Mark Fisher and Doreen Mende. The title of Mark's presentation is Capitalist Realism Now, and his talk will bring up to date his thinking around capitalist realism that he initially outlined in his 2009 book. Mark has also recently published Ghosts of My Life, Writings on Depression, Hauntology, and Lost Futures. And both this book and the Capitalist Realism book were published by Zero Books, where he is now a commissioning editor. His writing has appeared in a wide variety of publications, including Film Quarterly, The Wire, The Guardian, and Frieze. He's program leader of the MA in Oral and Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London, and a lecturer at the University of East London. He was a founding member of the influential Cybernetic Culture Research Unit at the Philosophy Department of University of Warwick, Coventry in 1995. And then we'll move straight into Doreen's talk. Doreen's presentation is titled Cape Bremer, The Artist Should Be an Official, and we'll focus on the work of Cape Bremer, a relatively under-acknowledged artist who exhibited with René Bloch in the early 1970s, both in Berlin and New York. Doreen has flown here from London in the middle of installing a retrospective of Cape Bremer at Raven Row, which promises to be a fascinating exhibition. Doreen lives in Berlin and works internationally as a curator, lecturer, and editor. Her concept-driven projects often involve research with image archives in relation to economics, display practices, non-Western internationalisms, non-aligned histories, solidarity, and geopolitics. She has taught at the Dutch Art Institute since 2010 and received her PhD from the Curatorial Knowledge Programme at Goldsmiths, University of London. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm in danger of disappointing everybody today, because there'll be people here who've read the book, and there'll be people who haven't read the book, in recapitulate the main theses of the book, might bore the people who've read the book, but if I don't do that, I might disappoint the people who haven't read it. So it's a bit of a tough one, but I'll do my best anyway. It's a shame I missed the show here and in Dusseldorf, and I've limited knowledge actually of the original use of the term capitalist realism. So that'll be a useful learning exercise for me this afternoon actually. My own use of the term capitalist realism had no reference to that original 60s German use. I mean, I suppose it's a fairly obvious play on words, really, in relation to socialist realism. I'm not sure people now hear the echo of socialist realism in the term capitalist realism, actually, in the way they probably, well, almost certainly would have done in the 60s. But okay, so what I'm going to try and do is then, as I say, at the risk of boring those who've read the book, go over the main thesis of the claim about what capitalist realism is. Also give a bit of personal contextualisation, where the idea came from, and then a bit of extrapolation, and a bit of a sense of where we are now, 5 years after the book came out. So the joke I always make is, but bear in mind that the book was being finished in 2008, 2009, right at the point at which the financial crisis erupted. And it really did seem as if the book would be out of date before it even came out because of this kind of major trauma for capitalism. It just obviously didn't work out that way at all. And perhaps the book, is some explanation of why that is the case, of why the financial crisis, didn't bring about a serious, it was an economic crisis, didn't bring about a serious kind of ideological crisis for capitalism, or at least not one that has cost it thus far very much. Okay, well, the thing I usually say about capitalist realism, in my sense, is that it's fairly easy to spot it, but it's harder to define it, actually. One could say that it's a belief. It's a belief that capitalism is the only viable political economic system, and a lot of the book came out of a riff from that phrase from Frederick Jameson, although he attributes it to some nameless third party, the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The problem is, whose belief is this? And also the very use of the term capitalism, is problematic because it's precisely, one could say what's at stake in the concept of capitalist realism, in my sense, is the very disappearance of the concept of capitalism as such. Capitalism is so naturalized that it no longer appears as a specific kind of mode of social relations, mode of political economic organisation. It recedes into being an ambient background, and therefore it disappears. Because it's not as if the majority of the population is spending a lot of time thinking about capitalism. And I think that's fairly clear. So that's what I mean by whose belief is this? Whose belief is it that capitalism is the only viable economic system, political economic system? It's putting it like that, it's a belief, it's clearly some kind of shorthand, actually. Another way of getting at it, what capitalist realism is, would be as an attitude of kind of fatalistic submission, really. A sense that capitalism is inevitable. There's no point fighting it. Again, though, I think this is too individualised a way of grasping it. It's a kind of useful first sketch of capitalist realism, but ultimately it's too individualised, it's too psychologised a way of grasping capitalist realism itself. In lots of ways, these attitudes and these beliefs are really the symptom of something more deeper, more transpersonal, an impersonal ideological field. That quotation of Richard's read out from the book, this diffuse atmosphere, I think captures more closely what's the statement of capitalist realism. So within those problems of definition aside, let's kind of approach this in a crab-like motion or sideways. I mean, capitalist realism, as I understand it, the pathology of the left, broadly understood. I mean, in the broadest sense of the left, including the very, very soft left of the parliamentary politics. Which I don't. So I mean, Richard mentioned 1989 as the major threshold. You know, the disintegration of state socialism, actually existing communism, leaving us only with actually existing capitalism. But I mean, that's the second big threshold. I mean, the first big one, of course, was a decade before that, 1979, 1980, the arrival of Reagan and Thatcher. And one could say that, you know, broadly speaking, the 80s was the period in which capitalist realism was fought for, was implemented. The 90s was when it was secured. You know, they all joke about Tony Blair being Margaret Thatcher's greatest achievement. You know, it's certainly true in many respects. Capitalist realism, I think, in the sense I understand it, really only emerged after in the 90s. And I think it's a somewhat parallel with Clinton and Blair, really. I mean, but in the UK, I mean, the Labour Party had been using this rhetoric of realism even before Thatcher, actually. Right at the end of the 70s, there was a sense that things couldn't carry on as they'd been carrying on, that kind of social democratic, broadly social democratic post-war settlement in the UK was no longer sustainable. And you know, that rhetoric started to be used by Labour politicians in the 70s, intensified in the 80s, as you know, this narrative about time started to emerge. I think this is kind of crucial to capitalist realism. Is this big story about the development of history, really, and what modernisation means, the meaning of modernisation. You know, absolutely crucial to Blair, to Blair's vision, was this notion that the Labour Party could not be elected if it didn't modernise. Well, that's certainly true. But what was his meaning of modernisation? His meaning of modernisation was simply neoliberalisation. That, you know, and you know, there was a successful imposition of this kind of historical narrative that the attachment of most of the attachments of the Labour Party to organised labour, etc., were old-fashioned, unsustainable. You know, hence the whole use of the term New Labour, you know, was established as temporality. New Labour versus old. Of course, who can be on the side of the old? Who can be against modernisation? Now, the effect of this, although this is really rather than actually modernising the Labour Party, of course, the real effect of this was to surrender modernity to neoliberal capitalism. So modernisation, as I said, then simply is understood to equal neoliberal capitalism. And something that this equation is accepted kind of blithely, and a lot of the news outlets in the UK would often use modernisation in this uncritical way. You know, if there's a strike, it'll often be narrated as the the workers are resisting modernisation. So the underlying notion there then, which kind of guided Blair, I think, also said, I think it was a parallel with Clinton as well, but perhaps most explicit, the most, the postmodern messianism of Blair meant it was much more zealous in his explicit advocacy of this position. So I think the book Capitalist Realism is a book about Blair and Blairism fundamentally. It's about that was the I would say to sort of reduce it to saying sort of about that, but that was the I think initial inspiration. So the simple idea that capitalism is the only game in town, and all we can do is adjust to it. And this notion of adjustment, I think this is what it is to be realistic. So a series of moves have happened then. So one is to consign the old left to the past. But it's not only, of course, it's not only the old left that gets consigned to the past. It's really the left as such in many ways. So what the Blairism becomes this model for capitalist realism, copied by many other parties in Europe, particularly. When a model is, okay, we broadly accept capitalism, but we hope to introduce some kind of small measures of social justice around the outside. That's the best one can hope for now. This talking down of expectations is partly what is meant by this realism. Once it was possible to struggle against capitalism, but no longer. That's the either explicit or implicit message of those politicians who accepted capitalist realism. Partly why I came to all this was really working in a Blairite institution. I was working as a teacher in a further education college from the early 2000s to late, so most of the decade, most of the last decade. And that's the further education colleges, I think, are like community colleges here. And what one experienced was this kind of ratcheting up of Blairism over the period of that decade. And how that manifests itself most obviously was this increased control and regulation of work via a battery of bureaucratic procedures, login books, performance reviews, planning documents that were vast exercises in simulation in which bore only a limited relationship to anything that anyone thought would actually ever happen in the classroom. But of course, no one thought this was good. No one in the college, the other teachers, and crucially, the management was imposing it. No one thought, this is really going to improve my practice as a teacher. That if we do this, if I fill in this logbook, if I do this performance review, I will be a much better teacher after this. No one believed that. So, on behalf of the fellow workers, what you have is an attitude of kind of weary resignation. We just have to do this. Generally, this was fixed. The attitude of the managers was kind of more complicated, typically. It was similarly fatalistic. But they had to sort of push these measures through, so they had to sort of make some sort of case for them. But the case was not that they would do anything like they were supposed to do. It's that really it's just the path of least resistance. If we do this stuff, then our lives will be easier than if we try to not do it. Really, I think that I mean, part of the context of this thing is that there's no sense that this could be politically struggled against. The background here was one of radical depoliticisation. And that's part of realism. It's just how things are now that we have to do this stuff. We didn't used to have to do it, but now we do. The future only holds the prospect of doing more and more of this kind of work. So the managers would say, well, this is just how things are done now. I don't like it much more than you do. It's pointless, but it's pointless to fight it. I think in the book I give that anecdote of one of the managers who, when my colleagues and I completed one of these self-assessment documents, the manager said, yeah, it's okay, you're just not critical enough of yourselves in this book. So that this form of what I call market stylism was also this kind of market Maoism, this demand for kind of self-criticism. But that wasn't the worst bit about it. The worst bit about it was the fact that he then said, look, you can make lots of criticisms of yourself, nothing will ever happen. So the sheer kind of utter cynicism, to be first of all required to go through this kind of ritualistic self-denigration, and then to be told that it's just an empty exercise in simulation that is utterly meaningless anyway. I don't know which is worse. Certainly the two together are horrible. I think what's kind of crucial to this and to capitalist realism in general is the idea that it's not necessarily good, these things, but they are inevitable. And I think that this is I don't think, for instance, neoliberalism has managed to sell itself to the majority of the population, actually. It's the best way of running things. But it has managed to sell itself as, on the side of the force that is going to win. I think that's another sense of what it get into what is at stake in capitalist realism is that sense that we can't fight it. It's going to win anyway. We might not like it, but we have to do it. But I quickly sort of, I suppose, reflected on the fact that there's something strange was going on here. In that there was a clear kind of dissonance between what we were living as teachers and more broadly as public service workers, because of these kind of new regulatory apparatuses that we were subject to in the teaching profession were also being imposed across public services under Blairism. There's a clear dissonance between what we were living as workers in those institutions and the narrative that we were given, the broad narrative we were giving about life under neoliberal governments. No, simply that the bureaucracy was supposed to be exactly the kind of thing that neoliberalism had delivered us from, wasn't it? That wasn't bureaucracy, exactly the kind of thing that that superseded state socialist monoliths imposed on it. Hadn't we got rid of all that? How is it then that professions like teachers found themselves subject to increasing and unprecedented amounts of bureaucracy under a system of governance which allegedly was opposed to bureaucracy? There's a clear inconsistency. Partly there is a difference, though. There is a difference between this new bureaucracy and the older bureaucracy. The new bureaucracy is typically a form of self-policing. This bureaucracy is outsourced to individuals. Bureaucrats don't fill in the forms for us. We fill in self-assessment forms ourselves. The old regulatory agencies, that's only part of the story, because it's not as if the old regulatory agencies had disappeared. They disappeared for capitalists, but not for us. So we had a lot of the old, already existing bureaucratic regulatory mechanisms, and on top of those were these, this proliferation of self-surveillance machineries as well, which would multiply by the week. I think that the further thought here is that what are these things really aimed at? I think that's what we have to ask. We're all subject to these things, almost no matter what the level of work now. There's this requirement for self-surveillance, for this performance of self-regulation. What is this really about? Given that it manifestly does not meet the goals that it ostensibly is supposed to. As I said before, no one really believes this improves performance or increases the efficiency of work. I mean, no one can believe that. The very fact you're doing it means you're decreasing your efficiency as a worker, actually. It means you're distracted from what you've done, your core task as an educator you think ought to be. I mean, I would say that the real aim of this stuff is precisely the affective consequences that it brings about, i.e., the anxiety that these things bring about is the real aim of them. Disables agency of the worker. It's part of a project of resubordinating workers, really. Keeping workers in a perpetual state of anxiety. Anxiety is highly functional in that way. And this brings me to one of the other sort of key themes, strands of the book is mental health, really, politics of mental health. I think in some ways, to be a bit crude and schematic about it, you could chart the rise of capitalist realism on one axis, the decline of anti-psychiatry on the other hand, actually. As anti-psychiatry kind of waned, so capitalist realism could emerge. But I mean, the anti-psychiatry in the 60s was organised around quite extreme conditions, such as schizophrenia. I think that the kind of politics of capitalist realist mental health are concentrated around much more banal and widespread conditions such as depression. This being part of what I call privatisation of stress in the book. This is a very efficient mechanism, I think, for as part of this project of resubordination, part of a project of responsibilisation, which I think is key to the kind of neoliberal worldview. If your working conditions decline, if you're getting paid less, if you're required to do more work for effectively the same or less money, those are objective stresses, right? Those things clearly just make your life worse. It isn't your fault. But I think the dominant paradigms, the dominant stories about mental health, encourage us to take responsibility for those things. So, just crudely speaking, whereas once we'd have, when those things have happened, you go to a trade union official, or engage and struggle against them. Now we're encouraged to, go to the doctor and get a chemical solution, or else tell ourselves a more positive story about things. These are two dominant approaches, right? There's kind of the chemical imbalance story, and the kind of therapy-light, cognitive behavioural therapy story. It's not that neither of these things work, or sometimes, but I mean, quite clearly, I don't think they get into the real causation of widespread mental health problems, such as depression. Just simply put, even if depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain, it doesn't tell us anything about what's causing that chemical imbalance in the brain. and certainly why by most metrics there's been an increase in depression and rates of depression, particularly amongst the young. It seems to me that it's pretty obvious why the depression would have grown, particularly amongst the young, and exactly these conditions of increased precariousness, casualisation, generalised insecurity. These conditions will produce more anxiety. That anxiety will inevitably be manifested in pathology such as depression. So it seems to me anyway that these two dimensions of experience under late capitalism, experience of bureaucracy, and the experience of so-called mental health issues were potentially fruitful areas for politicisation. Because the very point about them is that they are depoliticised. As I said, the bureaucratic procedures were accepted as how things were, not the subject of political struggle. Mental health conditions, were accepted as just a biological, either down to biology, to family background. And I think, particularly with mental health issues, so many people suffer from them that I think there's an opportunity there to effectively reframe narratives people have got about themselves and the world around them, moving away from this kind of compulsory, punitive responsibilisation that has been so much a feature of neoliberalism and capitalist realism. And towards looking at the kind of impersonal causation of what goes on in the so-called interior life. But such politicization is not easy, to say the least. Given the destruction of the agents who might have carried it out, such as trade unions, and the failure of any new agents to emerge, which could replace those older agents in a sustained way, I think. Also, clearly what we're looking at here is not just a political program narrowly defined. It's something that has been imposed throughout culture and can call upon widespread support for its basic tenets and the basic tenets of capitalist realism. One example of that, would be reality TV, I think. It's no accident that the term reality in reality TV, that reality TV should become the dominant entertainment form of the first decade of the 21st century, the period of high capitalist realism, I think, the late 90s, early 21st century, before 2008. That was coincided with the rise of reality TV. The naturalisation of competition, which is key to virtually any model of reality TV, actually. Although, actually, if you look at reality TV, that competition amongst individuals or groups almost always has to be artificially imposed, actually. And then, alongside that, there's explicit kind of business propaganda in some forms of reality TV, like The Apprentice. Just normalise the perspective of business and demands that we adjust to this as precisely the model of reality. So what we've seen really is a successful struggle waged by the right on many fronts simultaneously. They understand how to win hegemony, and the trouble with the right, at least it was that they know what to do and they do it. We don't have that problem. Just simply two fronts, carrot and stick. The attack on organised labour, both practically and ideologically, which Tony Blair celebrated. He's famously proud of the fact that, as he said, Britain has got some of the most stringent anti-trade union legislation in the world now. That was great. So on the one hand, the attack on organised labour, the demotion of the whole model of organised labour, collectivism to belong to some superseded moment of the past, and on the other hand, the seduction to individualised consumerism. Now, this, as I said, the key battleground for this, I think, was in the 80s. The right sort of harvested the fruits of that in the 90s. And so the effect of this is the default to reset everybody's society, and in particular institutions. I mean, one thing we have to bear in mind here is the neoliberal sleight of hand that allows this to happen, where a disdain for the state, you know, it's typical of neoliberalism, is a rhetorical disdain for the state, at the same time as neoliberals make sure they occupy the state and instrumentalise the state for their project. Now, their project is a project of occupying and controlling the state, quite clearly. As I indicated at the start of the talk, the crisis has clearly been not enough to overthrow capitalist realism. In some ways, the financial crisis has intensified capitalist realism, particularly in the heartlands of capitalist realism here in the UK, I think. Austerity programs are really only possible on the basis of the kind of underlying capitalist realist kind of infrastructure, kind of psychic infrastructure. But I mean, capitalist realism, I think, did change tone after the crisis. The gambit shifted. Before the crisis, it was join us or die. You know, if you don't come with us, you'll be crushed. You'll either be crushed by the judgment of capitalism or left to die in your own piss, completely ignored and no one will care. It's up to you. Afterwards, it was join us or we're all fucked. I think this is the term now, really, and it's particularly, brazen in the UK with the Tory-led coalition government's phrase, you know, we're all in this together. I mean, and that's clearly been used to then, the crisis then has been used to further embed capitalist realism and its deep cradles. Social security is unaffordable, might be nice, you know, this is part of the term of capitalist realism, might be nice, you might like to do it, but, you know, it's just not adult or responsible to do it. We can't be romantic about it. Public services are bloated, need to be cut back. Pension schemes are unaffordable, unworkable, etc. In the UK, this became a kind of form of almost, I think you have to understand this more as neuro-linguistic programming, actually. What happened with the Cameron government, just obsessively repeating false mantras until it didn't matter that they were false. You kept saying them and they became taken for reality. I mean, the key thing there being that it was the overspending of the Labour government which had caused the financial crisis. Something which they were allowed to keep saying over and over. And as the New Economics Foundation put it, and I think part of the success of the right in managing the crisis has been its simple narrative. It's got a simple story explaining it. The story is, Blairite governments overspent on social services, etc. That's why we got a mess. The story about the banks, global finance, virtual capitalism, a lot more complicated to try and tell that. And I think that the right has profited from that. Of course, we have seen opposition, but I think we'd all have to say that which has not succeeded. Whether it be the Occupy movement, which is obviously much more significant here than in the UK, or it's a bit miserable, to be honest. In the UK, we also had the student militancy for a brief period in the end of 2010 and riots in 2011. But none of these proved capable of mounting a kind of sustained assault on capitalist realism. And it's partly because capitalist realism is just not susceptible to direct action. It isn't imposed by direct action, it's imposed by indirect action. This is the work of ideologies, is indirect action. I mean, you could say, what is ideology? It's not what you believe, it's what you believe the other believes. And so it's the other we have to persuade, not ourselves in a certain way, and that this involves this indirect mediation. What is taken for reality is generated ideologically. There's no escape from ideology as such. But we need to seize the controls of reality production, of where reality is, of what counts as reality is produced. And that I think that has to involve so-called mainstream media, what neo-anarchists call MSN, and parliamentary politics at some level has to be involved here. It's not that these things in themselves will solve anything. I think one dimension of capitalist realism is perhaps the form that anti-capitalism itself has taken on, perhaps the form anti-capitalism as such, you could say, in a certain way. But certainly the kind of a justified cynicism about mainstream media and about parliamentary politics, I think the direct consequence of Blairism and Clintonism. I think a whole generation, if not more than one generation, has been utterly disillusioned by what happened with Blair and Clinton, and probably also with Obama now as well. But I think it's fairly clear that unless we've got some input there, unless we've got some influence in the mainstream politics, mainstream media, then we'll be condemned into this marginal position. We'll be condemned into this position of being subordinated to a reality which is still being defined by capital. But I mean, it's clearly that we shouldn't fall into the opposite solution of thinking you can just solve things from within mainstream politics or within mainstream media. That was the fallacy of Blairism. But part of what made Blairism what it was the disintegration of the wider movements around, the Labour Party, around other similar parties around the world. It was the disarticulation between parliamentary parties and the wider movements. So once these parties come to power, they've got nothing to fall back on. And I think that anti-capitalism and has intensified that disarticulation and that split. And I think we need to kind of reverse that. Who can be naive now about who can be naive about the possibilities of parliamentary politics? Nobody. But at the same time, a kind of complete disdain for that, I think, just plays into the hands of the neoliberals. As I say, they want control of the state. They want us to give up on that terrain. They want it for themselves, and they've had it. So uncontested for the last 30 years. So I mean, I think it's become increasingly clear that sporadic oppositionism won't work, and we need to be in a business of old-fashioned business of hegemony building. And that involves, I think, a problem of coordinating resources, of building of heterogeneous alliances. I mean, if you look at the success of the right, that's what the right does very well. It's built up alliances between very unlikely groups. I mean, the founding moment of Realism with the religious right plus free market liberals, what have they got in common with each other? Almost nothing. Yet, again, it's the right who seem to learn these lessons about taught by people like Stuart Hall better than the left, about the contingency of any connections, the contingency of any articulations, that heterogeneous things can be articulated together. What is presented to us as natural is actually a series of articulations which can be disarticulated. Equally, things which seem to have no natural fit together can be articulated together. The right knows this; it does it all the time, to our cost, I think. And I think around that, though, I mean, we need generation of new forms of solidarity. extremely difficult. Alongside that, I mean, which may emerge from these new sites of struggle that I indicated before, such bureaucracy or mental health, or not so much new sites of struggle in the case of mental health, but a former site of struggle which needs to be reoccupied. I think to sort of end on a somewhat optimistic note, I mean, the right clearly hasn't got many new ideas now. I mean, it's had its chance. It doesn't have anything left. It doesn't seem to. It's had whatever 5 years since the 6 years since the financial crisis. It hasn't got anything else. Neoliberalism is the best it can offer, and all it has offered is neoliberalism Mark II. That puts us in a quite different situation to what we have been, I think, for quite some time. The right could always be relied upon to have some kind of improvisational strategy in place in order to seize control of the future. I don't think it has that anymore. It's been a shift in some ways from neoliberalism to kind of nihiliberalism, where no one believes this stuff anymore, but it just carries on. So I think that that is a space of opportunity for us. They don't have any big projected story going forward. All they've got is the same old one continuing. And this is our chance for intervention in this moment, perhaps unprecedented in many ways. Okay, well, I'll leave it there.
If anybody's got any immediate questions, I think now would be a good time to take a few before we move on to Doreen. I have one question, Mark, and it's more to kind of take a step back a little bit, I guess, and to ask you about just this very act of naming capitalist realism, of re-adopting capitalism as something that existed in a different form previously, but just in the very act, how do you perceive that as being an important move towards this disturbance of a naturalized ideology, to kind of to take that naming act as a critical moment? Because I'm thinking in a way towards there are historical precedents in the 60s of how that kind of act of naming was a slightly parodic act. It was a kind of gesture towards a kind of irony around the artistic movement and the collectivization of that as a kind of career gesture almost.
Yeah, but I think it's also in that case about drawing attention to the ways in which things like advertising functioned analogous to Stalin's propaganda, etc., etc. But I think probably that's the chief contribution that I've made with the book, was being able to name it. I mean, you could say that, if it weren't for that, the book would just reinforce the very conditions that it's describing. So I think naming of capitalist realism then was the provisional act of denaturalization. So, and the repoliticization, you could say. So, we could all start to check ourselves whenever we started to do that shrug of, this is how things are now, we've just got to accept it, sort of thing. There's that set of kind of behavioural and linguistic tropes which we fall into. We could certainly identify them as as political, as consequences of a political strategy from the other side, actually. So, I think that is perhaps the most important thing that I did with the name, actually.
Thanks, Mark, for your presentation. I'm curious what you think about the ecological crisis.
Yeah.
And I think that Ryan McCline's book that's about to come out called This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And for her, the ecological crisis is a game changer in terms of re-energizing an energy that we haven't seen before, at least not recently, in terms of a direct anti-capitalist struggle. So how do you see that? How do you see ecology and the looming crisis in relationship to capitalist realism?
Yeah, I think you mentioned it very briefly in the book, but I think it could be the crucial thing. But I think here we really confront the strong distinction between capitalist realism and the real. The ecological crisis is absolutely real, but it can't be accommodated into realism, can't be accommodated into capitalist realism. I think here we see the real point of extreme friction here, that it's not realistic to implement such measures that would save our own our environment from total destruction. So people can, I think it's quite interesting, people can both at one and the same time say capitalism is the only realistic political system and it's going to burn out our environment somehow. The problem is how long that dissonance can persist, really. Actually, I think to solve the ecological crisis, we'll need the kind of collective agency such as we've never seen before, and it would be precisely something that is completely unrealistic from the current ordinance we've got. But the unrealistic, I guess part of the point of what I'm saying is what counts as realistic or unrealistic is politically determined, not determined by the actual conditions in place. So yes, I believe that this could become crucial, though people do seem to be able to manage this distance quite effectively. And there is the danger it's feeding into the crisis is feeding into this sense of kind of nihilistic hopelessness, I think. Unless there's the emergence of an agent which can grasp it. Because I think many people think, yeah, well, that's inevitable, capitalism's inevitable as well. There's not a lot we can do about it. I think it's, in order for it to actually break capitalist realism down, people need a sense that they can actually do something about it. And that is what is lacking.